There's a lot of division in our culture today, and for that reason, division is a theme that arises in a lot of the videos I make. I mean, if you look at any issue, you're likely going to find two opposing narratives that dominate over all of the rest. So, in this video, I'll be specifically addressing the growing division between young men and women. And with that, I'm also going to discuss the related meaning crisis that is playing out in lockstep with this division between sexes. And if you haven't heard of or personally been affected by this so-called meaning crisis, I recommend you look into some of John Vervaeke's work on YouTube. I think that's how you pronounce his name. And I'll leave a link to his channel in the description. But in short, many young people are having trouble finding a deeper meaning in life to give them a reason to wake up in the morning. And I don't want to make this problem seem like it's exclusive to young people, because obviously there's plenty of old people who are just as lost. But in this video, I will largely be referring to young people. So, as I suggested already, this meaning crisis is related to the growing division between young men and women. So, I guess I'll clarify what growing division I'm referring to. First and foremost, young people are having fewer children. This trend has been around for a while now. And while it might not be directly indicative of division between men and women, there's some other data that certainly is indicative of this division. For example, young people are dating and marrying less too. A recent poll I saw shows 63% of men in their 20s are single, and 34% of women in that same age bracket are single as well. And I'll link that poll in the description if you're interested. But many people are calling this a loneliness epidemic. Now, obviously there's a notable gap between the percentage of single men and women in their 20s. Most of that gap can be explained by women simply dating older men. That's really the only thing that can explain a gap outside of bad polling data. Now, at this point, I want to make very clear what the goal of this video is and what the antithesis of that goal is. So, to start with what I will not be doing, I will not be pushing narratives that seek to make the division between young men and women worse. In other words, I will not be placing blame on young women for dating older men. And contrary to that narrative, I'm also not going to place blame on young men for being unworthy of these young women. There are a lot of content creators today that are building these echo chambers who will side with men or women in this debate. And then they'll attempt to blame the loneliness epidemic, the meaning crisis, entirely on the opposition, right? On the opposite sex. I'm not going to do that, Instead, my actual goal with this video is to explain why the narratives in these echo chambers are not only wrong, but destructive. And to do that, I'm going to look closer at these divisive narratives that are increasingly turning men and women against each other, particularly young men and women, in order to find the underlying catalyst of that growing division. And it's important to point out that even though young men are single at almost twice the rate of young women, the overall trend is that the rate of young single men and women is increasing, So no matter what any single man or woman may say, this meaning crisis, this loneliness epidemic is affecting both sexes. And I'll explain that a little deeper as we go on. But I'll also add that these divisive narratives aren't the only ones being pushed, They may not even be the dominant narratives. I'm not trying to make it seem like everybody falls for every narrative they see in a YouTube video or in mainstream media. There are a lot of positive narratives that encourage strong relationships among young people, And I don't want to diminish their relevance. In fact, I seek to bolster them. And the truth is, if you aren't falling victim to these narratives that seek to divide young men and women, then this video isn't directed at you. However, if you have a friend who has been getting frustrated with their lack of dating prospects and they're getting bitter at the opposite sex because of it, I suggest you watch the rest anyway, because it might enable you to help them. But to start, let's look deeper at these narratives, these divisive narratives between young men and women. We're going to start with the anti-female narrative, all right? A lot of men blame young women for being too egotistical. The onset of social media and selfies and all that probably has a lot to do with it. And some men will argue that women's standards are too high and that women are constantly reaching out of their league for men that will ultimately only use them without any commitment. Maybe a man will get rejected because he isn't tall or rich enough. And men will also blame women for being too promiscuous. Again, social media, in particular, OnlyFans and these dating apps are probably part of the problem there. And then there's also the Me Too movement, right? The Me Too movement seems to be scaring a lot of young men away from even looking for relationships. Again, possibly a function of social media. So, how about the anti-male narrative? Well, many women will blame young men for their lack of dating prospects in their age range, often citing financial instability or outright immaturity. Maybe the younger men don't have the stable jobs or the college education, or maybe they're unemployed altogether and they're still living with their parents. Women might say young men have no direction, no goals or motivation. So, in this instance, most of the problems young women have with young men are economic in nature, okay, in combination with low ambition. So, the overall pattern here is that some young men blame young women for having high standards, okay? In other words, young women are supposedly too egotistical. And some young women will blame young men for a lack of financial stability and ambition. Now, instead of labeling these opposing narratives wrong, let's instead try and think about a set of environmental factors that could make both narratives right at the same time. This might seem like a strange approach, but let's think about it for a minute, all right? Let's imagine that young men are indeed financially unstable and immature, and that young women are so egotistical that they're dating out of their league. To start, let's see if we can find some environmental factor that would explain why young men are increasingly financially unstable. Well, wages have stagnated since the 1980s, all right, correlating very closely with a certain Ronald Reagan and his economic policies. Now, I'm not going to go into the failures of Reaganomics in this video, but the fact remains, most people are making less money, and that means that young men and women will fall victim to wage stagnation like everybody else does. I've seen some statistics that even show young women are making more than young men nowadays. So we've identified that young men are, in fact, financially unstable, and we've identified that the economy is the culprit, okay, and increasingly so. In other words, the young women are right. Young men are increasingly financially unstable, and that's the reason young women give for not dating these young men. And in the eyes of these young women, this lack of financial stability manifests as a lack of ambition. So, what could explain the growing egotistical nature of young women? Well, as I already pointed out, social media isn't helping, all right? But the stagnating wages are also affecting young women. So when they choose men who are more financially sound than themselves, it creates this phenomenon where young men seem to think women are reaching for men out of their league, hence the accusation of egoism, okay? But if it's financial instability that makes young women avoid young men, why would their standards be so high in the first place? Is it because women are inherently spoiled? Is it because they're inherently egotistical and they are inherently driven to reach out of their league? Well, yes, actually, okay? The young men are also right. And before you get angry with me and click away, let's consider why women might be naturally inclined to have such high standards, okay? Emphasis on the fact that it is a natural inclination. Well, women, females that is, bear children. So in order to support a child, a woman needs to find a man that can support not one, not two, but three people at the same time. Okay, that's a very high bar. A man needs to provide resources for himself, a potential child, and the woman herself when she is busy caring for the child. In other words, women have high standards for a very, very good reason, okay? This accusation of egoism from some men is being manifested by nature. It's not some cultural phenomenon. It is a natural response to the economic strife that is creating resource scarcity in the environment. This is a necessary instinct to keep children alive. It's basically a vetting process manufactured by thousands of years of evolution, and it is rightfully very strict. So the fact that young women, or women in general, are choosing those older men who are financially stable is not some strange, unpredictable phenomenon. It is literally the logical expectation. We have a younger population who are naturally inclined to have less children. If women are choosing not to settle for lower standards, those standards are simply not good enough to provide for children. And those standards are created by our economy. And what role does social media play in all this? Well, there's a limited number of young men who can support children, and social media enables women to effectively advertise themselves to the older men instead. But this doesn't mean that social media made women more egotistical. Social media just amplified natural female instincts, and the algorithms that seek to maximize ad revenue latched on with a vengeance. And this ended up creating this illusion that female behavior changed drastically in the past 20 years. But again, it is just an illusion, okay? Nothing about technology inherently leads to egoism. Social media and other technology in general is not the original catalyst of any problem in particular. They're just tools that can be used to worsen the pre-existing symptoms of resource scarcity, if that is indeed how we choose to use them. So, how does this growing divide between men and women relate to the meaning crisis? Well, the most default purpose ingrained into our instincts beyond eating and sleeping is reproduction and raising offspring. All right? Take note that eating and sleeping don't exactly do a great job at providing a purpose in the long term. They just simply provide a means to fulfill the greater long-term purpose of reproduction. And this purpose goes for both men and women. Every single person alive on this planet right now has an undefeated list of ancestors that managed to raise offspring in a sufficient enough manner to keep their genes in the gene pool. Everyone else that failed to reproduce and care for their children have been removed from the gene pool. So what's the implication when young men and women en masse systematically stop having children? Well, the only logical conclusion is that we will devolve into a population that increasingly lives without the primary default purpose, that is reproduction. Okay, after all, reproduction is how we got here. The end result is a meaning crisis or a purpose crisis, and I'm using meaning and purpose interchangeably here. Now, maybe it's not obvious to you that a lack of meaning leads to a crisis. So we have to ask, what about a lack of meaning insinuates a crisis? If we wanted to put a statistic on this meaning crisis, how would we do it? Well, to start, let's look for some signs of a decline in collective purpose. What would signify that society's collective magnitude of purpose is decreasing? Well, if you don't have a purpose, then you have no stake in your future. And what happens when people don't care about their future? Well, people start to behave recklessly, okay? After all, if you don't care about your future, why not make today your last day? So now I'll ask, what are some signs that reckless behavior is increasing? I mean, that one's easy. Have you seen the number of cyclists out there? They just prance around with these 5,000-pound death machines for fun. But on a much more serious note, suicide is on the rise. Crime is on the rise. Depression, anxiety rates are increasing. Obesity is increasing. Drug addiction is through the roof. In other words, these suicides and these school shootings, these drug overdoses, and all these other diseases of despair put the crisis in the phrase meaning crisis. And much of that meaning crisis stems from our diminishing reproductive capacity. Humans simply don't behave in a healthy manner when their environment fails to provide for children. And that checks out, right? If the environment isn't providing for children, how is it providing for the adults that are currently living in it? Now, that's not to say that everyone must source all of their meaning in life from reproduction and raising children. It's definitely possible to find a fulfilling purpose elsewhere. And that's the ultimate question here. How are we replacing this growing void of meaning that's developing due to the growing divide between young men and women? Unfortunately, the most relevant answer to that question is consumerism, okay? Materialism. Now, some people might create a diverse community of friends to find deeper meaning outside of raising offspring, and others might hop in and out of casual relationships to fill sexual desires, but by and large, people are just going to start buying shit to fill the lack of purpose in their life. And I'll also point out that when we poll young people, most of the leading reasons they give for not having children are economic in nature. So, despite the fact that these divisive narratives I laid out are prevalent in our culture today, they're not actually dominant, okay? What this means is that most young men and women are actually aware of the underlying catalyst that is the economy, and they're mostly not falling for these divisive narratives. But that doesn't mean they aren't falling into the consumerism traps that capitalism steers us into. So, to go over this one more time, in case you didn't pick up on the whole process, 60% of people are living paycheck to paycheck. Wealth inequality, or poor resource allocation, whichever description you prefer, is causing a growing divide between young men and women. More division between men and women means less children. We have a meaning crisis developing from the lack of purpose that naturally occurs when you strip humans of their reproductive capacity. We have increasing reckless behaviors stemming from that meaning crisis. And our primary solution to the meaning crisis is consumerism, which ultimately contributes to the wealth inequality. This is what we call a vicious cycle. Our solutions are actually contributing to the problem because we've been manipulated into placing blame in the wrong places. The divisive content creators that create controversy between men and women are lying to you. They're only giving you half of the context, and then they're making money while they're doing it. They tell you to stay single and live independent lives of material luxury, and then, wouldn't you know it, women don't accept the anti-female narrative, and men don't accept the anti-male narrative, and the division gets worse. Who could have possibly seen that coming? This phenomenon where men and women isolate themselves from each other is not an accident. In reality, both men and women are failing each other by failing to make an economy that can support children. This is an evolved response to environmental resource scarcity, and within the U.S. economy, resources are tied to the U.S. dollar. Our instincts are literally telling us, warning, environment not stable, stop reproducing. And this is especially dangerous when your entire economic structure depends on an increasing population and infinite growth. If you ever wondered why the border is open right now, I suspect it has something to do with the demand for cheap labor in the U.S. due to the lack of native-born children in recent years. This is getting out of the scope of this video, but it is important to point out because it is very relevant. Now, this unstable economy affects our instinctual reproductive capacity in other ways too. All right, it doesn't just stop with the division between men and women. So, what's another example of our instinctual reproductive capacity being diminished due to resource scarcity? Well, look at the LGBT community. The LGBT community is growing exponentially, okay, at a rate we could have never predicted even 20 years ago. Many would say this is due to some cultural phenomenon where social rights finally evolved enough to encourage people to leave the closet, per se. And maybe some other people might even argue the LGBT movement is grooming people, but I don't think either of those are true. I'd like to propose an alternate theory. Imagine instead that the growing LGBT movement is an instinctual response to resource scarcity. Okay, resource scarcity in our environment could literally just be suppressing reproductive instincts. In effect, the growing rates of people identifying as part of the LGBT community is basically our DNA finding its own methods of birth control. Right? After all, if everybody turns gay, lesbian, or trans, we're not going to be great at reproducing. If this theory is correct, it would mean that a growing LGBT community is literally a warning sign of economic collapse. Now, I'm not trying to put any blame on the LGBT community here. Okay, there's no bigotry on my part, but I would like you to consider the possibility that a growing LGBT community is a response, okay, a natural instinctual response to resource scarcity or poor resource allocation, okay? So rather than the growing LGBT movement being a result of progress in social rights, imagine instead that the resource scarcity is forcing social rights to evolve as our instincts play out this natural method of birth control, which is ultimately a growing LGBT movement. And to make a quick distinction between resource scarcity and poor resource allocation, I mean, the difference is pretty obvious, right? Resource scarcity is when there's not enough resources in the environment to provide for the life in that environment. And poor resource allocation is effectively manufactured scarcity caused by greed. And most of our scarcity today is manufactured, right? We have the food to feed everyone, we just choose not to. Bottom line, we need to do better. The fact that reckless behavior is on the rise is proof that the solutions we're using to fill this lack of purpose are not adequate. And the tools required to do better are already in our grasp. I mean, it doesn't matter if you look to religion or science or philosophy, no matter where you get your wisdom from. What do you think the wise religious prophets or the ancient philosophers and scientists would say if they saw the sheer magnitude of our wasted potential? I mean, the resource scarcity they had to persist through wasn't a choice. It was a direct limitation of the technology that was available to them at the time. I expect they would scoff at us for laughing in the face of all the suffering they endured to give us the cumulative advancements that we have today. So to conclude this video, I'll say this. We need to step back and look at the bigger picture when we look for solutions to problems. This is what allows us to recognize greater patterns that lead to the underlying catalysts, which are often hidden by surface level propaganda. The greater pattern I pointed out to you in this video is simple. We are losing our reproductive capacity. This is the most obvious sign of societal instability you could ask for. I mean, there's evidence of decreasing testosterone levels, sperm counts, and increasing infertility in general. Instead of looking at your lack of personal dating prospects as a phenomenon that can be blamed on individual behavior, think of it as part of an instinctual method of birth control that is manifesting due to the environmental factors that we all contribute to. Then we can think about ways to change our collective behavior together to address the underlying environmental factors. And in this case, we identified that the resource scarcity in our environment is the cause. So if you are a young man or young woman struggling to find your soulmate and you're being led into these narratives that seek to blame the opposite sex, I implore you to look deeper at the nature of this division. And in that same light, if you are a person who is falling into anti-LGBT rhetoric, you should look deeper at those hateful narratives too. Now, there are a couple other common arguments that people will use to explain our diminishing reproductive capacity, namely overpopulation and climate change. And often the argument is that overpopulation is the root cause of unsustainable climate change. While I agree that more people will ultimately amplify climate change, this amplification is not fundamentally different from the way that technology amplifies the female ego. Profit motives force the amplification in both cases. Our decision to choose unsustainable energy sources is the real catalyst of climate change, and our obedience to profit keeps us bound to those energy sources. So, yet again, profit motives and the accompanying resource scarcity are creating the illusion that overpopulation is problematic, when in reality, overpopulation is just a phenomenon that worsens the effects of the pre-existing problem of resource scarcity. I mean, when we make the determination that we are overpopulated, that determination is based on our ability or inability to sustainably provide resources for the population, no matter the size of that population. But people have been starving to death for all of recorded human history, okay? Resources have been scarce for all of history. So if you were to argue that resource scarcity is a function of overpopulation, you would be arguing that the world has always been overpopulated. In reality, with 21st century technology, overpopulation is the cop-out argument for poor resource allocation. The decreasing birth rates are not a function of overpopulation or irreversible climate change. We are just falling for these elusive narratives that distract us from identifying the underlying problem that is the greed. And the justifications for the greed itself are also illusions. Greed creates the scarcity, and the fear of scarcity justifies greedy behaviors. It's a cyclical argument that locks us into these vicious cycles. If we weren't so afraid of scarcity affecting us personally, we wouldn't need excess. But push the fear too high, and the excess reaches frankly ludicrous levels, and that ends up pushing so many people into poverty that revolutions emerge. This is how divide and conquer strategies work. And I mentioned in another video, divide and conquer strategies often leave out the final step. The full cycle is divide, conquer, and reset. Okay? We run this vicious cycle over and over again until the entire thing resets with what is often a revolution. That revolution is ultimately inevitable, but we collectively choose how we want it to play out. If you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. My choice is peaceful economic revolution, but if we collectively fall for divisive narratives that seek to divide the middle and lower class at the expense of addressing the wealth inequality, then that revolution will likely turn violent. We can all agree that there are many types of division. Okay, there are racial and cultural divides, political divides, especially national divides. We're familiar with all of these. They've been here as long as any of us can remember. Division at its core is ultimately isolation. Isolation is opposed to cooperation. All right, wherever isolation is increasing, cooperation is decreasing. Okay, we could say that isolation is inversely correlated with cooperation. It seems to me that all this national, political, cultural, and racial division has reached a critical mass. Right? These constructs can no longer contain the level of division in our society. And that division is now encroaching on one of the last holdouts of cooperation. This holdout is ultimately the cooperation between sexes. It's the relationship between men and women that keep the species reproducing. Different races and political parties can fight for centuries, but once the population stops replacing itself, the division can't even sustain itself. And that's exactly what we're seeing. We are becoming so divided that our instincts are forcing us to rethink our economic and social structures. I mean, the only holdout left after the sexes are divided is families themselves. When families start getting divided, that's when civil wars start. We need to heed this warning instead of falling into divisive narratives that make the problem worse. All right? Don't be a martyr. Do not hide your pain or try to convince yourself that your loneliness isn't real. Before you know it, the bitterness will boil up inside you. Okay, then you'll lash out at whoever the most recent viral clips on TikTok tells you to lash out at. This is how these radical feminism and incel communities get started and thrive. People suppress their pain and find poor solutions when the pain becomes unbearable. If we fail to identify the real catalyst that is ultimately the resource scarcity, and instead get distracted by narratives that blame each other, we will devolve into chaos. We will see more suicides, drug abuse, school shootings, and crime in general. We will see more loved ones fall victim to these diseases of disparity. And no matter how much you try to insulate yourself or your loved ones from the danger, you will be brought down with the collective if you choose division and isolation over unity and cooperation. Again, division, isolation, and competition are all logically opposed to unity and cooperation. Anytime you encourage competition for resources, you encourage division. On the other hand, if we all organize against the profit motives of those who seek to divide us, we can reverse this vicious cycle and evolve into something greater. We need to get rid of this illusion that we are separate spiritual bodies when we are in fact one spirit living in separate bodies inside a unified environment. This collective spirit and our separate bodies thrive best when we are in harmony with the environment, and they decay when we allow our egos to divide that environment among ourselves. We have all the tools to make or break ourselves, all right? Everything is a tool, from the devices that feed us information to the information itself. All we have to do is use the tools that unify us and leave behind the tools that divide us. It's literally that simple. Thank you for watching.